It was a warm, dizzy afternoon in downtown Miami, and people filled the bustling streets, going about their day. The sun was shining brightly, casting a golden glow over everything, and the sounds of honking cars and lively chatter filled the air. In the midst of all this, a woman named Lila Andrews quietly moved through the crowd, blending in like any other person. Dressed in a simple blue dress and comfortable shoes, she didn't look like anyone special. She had a shopping basket in hand, just another shopper picking up a few items on her day off. But Lila Andrews was no ordinary person. She was a decorated police captain, someone who had dedicated years of her life to serving her community. Through hard work, patience, and a strong sense of justice, she had earned respect and admiration in every police precinct where she had worked. Her career was full of stories of bravery and leadership, stories that only a few people truly knew. Her colleagues knew her as a fair, calm, and determined leader, yet today, no one around her seemed to notice. To the people passing by, she was just another shopper, someone to glance at, and then forget. Lila didn't mind being unnoticed. In fact, on her days off, she preferred it. She enjoyed the chance to blend in, to just be a part of the crowd, and do normal things like anyone else. Being in the background was refreshing, especially after so many days on duty, leading her team through intense situations and high-stress cases. Today, she was just Lila, a woman with a shopping list, taking a break from her demanding job, trying to enjoy a few moments of peace. As she moved down the aisles of the grocery store, her mind wandered. She thought about her work, her team, and the cases she'd handled recently. She knew that, as a black woman in law enforcement, her journey had not been easy. She had faced challenges and prejudices that many others had not, but she had learned to handle these situations with grace, to let her skills and character speak louder than anything else. Lila believed deeply in justice and fairness, and she knew that true strength often came from remaining calm, even in the face of misunderstanding and judgment. Today, however, she had no uniform, no badge, no symbols to remind people of who she really was. She had simply come out to pick up some groceries. To anyone watching, she was just another woman in a dress, moving quietly and peacefully through her day. But beneath that calm exterior, there was a strength that only those who knew her well could recognize, a strength that came from years of dedication, a quiet resilience that had guided her through both her personal and professional life. As she picked up items from the shelves, placing them carefully in her basket, she noticed a few people glancing her way, but she paid little attention to it. Miami was a busy place, filled with all kinds of people, and she was used to being in public spaces. Yet she couldn't shake a subtle feeling that something was off. The glances from some of the shoppers were a bit too long, and a few seemed to exchange hushed whispers as she passed by. She shrugged it off, reminding herself that she was here for a simple task, nothing more. Today was her day to relax, not to worry about anyone's opinions or judgments. Little did she know that the peace she had hoped for would be interrupted soon. Across the store, a police officer named Blake was on duty. Unlike Lila, Blake was known for his bold and sometimes brash behavior. He was a man who believed he could size up a person in a single glance, often jumping to conclusions without much thought. He had earned a bit of a reputation for his quick judgments, often targeting people based on his own assumptions. His sharp gaze scanned the store, looking for anything or anyone that seemed out of place. When his eyes landed on Lila, he saw what he wanted to see. She was just a woman in a plain dress, with no signs of status or importance. In Blake's eyes, she was suspicious, someone who might be up to no good. He couldn't see her strength, her years of service, or the respect she commanded within the police force. To him, she was just another shopper who didn't quite fit the image he had in mind for who belonged there. Blake decided to follow her, watching her every move with an intense focus. He saw her placing items in her basket and assumed she was acting strange. Every glance, every motion she made seemed, to him, like a sign of guilt. He believed he was reading her behavior accurately, convinced that his instincts were right. In his mind, she was up to something, and it was his duty to catch her in the act. Meanwhile, Lila continued her shopping, unaware of the eyes fixed on her from across the store. She moved calmly, taking her time with each item she selected, enjoying the rare quiet moments she had to herself. But as she reached for a jar on the shelf, she noticed Blake approaching. His expression was stern, his posture confident, as if he had already decided something about her. She felt a sudden change in the atmosphere as he came closer, a tension that made her pause. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firm, almost commanding. "I need to see some identification." Lila looked at him, surprised by his sudden approach. She was used to interactions with other officers, but this one felt different. There was no polite greeting, no simple question, only a demand. She could sense the distrust in his voice, the way he looked at her as if she were already guilty of something. "Identification," she asked calmly, meeting his gaze with quiet confidence. "Is there a reason for this, officer?" Blake narrowed his eyes, a hint of irritation flashing across his face. He was not used to being questioned, especially by someone he had already labeled as suspicious. To him, her calmness was a challenge, something that only made him more determined to prove himself right. "I'm just doing my job, Mom," he replied, his voice tinged with impatience. "There's been some suspicious activity here, and I need to make sure everything is in order." Lila felt the weight of his words, the underlying judgment that came with them. She had experienced this kind of treatment before, the assumptions and the doubts cast upon her simply because of who she was and how she looked. But she kept her expression steady, refusing to let his tone affect her. "Of course," she said, reaching into her purse for her wallet. She handed him her ID, her movements calm and deliberate. She watched as he looked at it, a brief flicker of surprise crossing his face when he saw her name and realized that she was no ordinary citizen. But he quickly hid his reaction, his expression hardening as he continued to scrutinize her. Blake's tone remained harsh as he asked, "What are you doing here today?" Lila raised an eyebrow at the question, her calm demeanor never wavering. "I'm here to do some grocery shopping, officer," she replied simply. "Is that a problem?" Her straightforward answer seemed to unsettle him, but he pressed on, convinced that there had to be more to her presence in the store. He asked her several questions, each one more pointed than the last, as if he were determined to uncover some hidden motive. Yet with each answer she gave, Lila remained calm and composed, answering him with the same level of respect she had shown from the start. The people around them began to take notice, watching the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Some whispered to each other, wondering what was going on. To them, it looked like just another ordinary woman being questioned, but they didn't know her story. They didn't know the strength and courage that lay beneath her quiet exterior, or the years of experience that had taught her to remain calm in moments like these. As the minutes passed, Blake grew more frustrated, his voice growing louder with each question. But Lila never faltered. She knew who she was, and she knew that she had done nothing wrong. She wasn't just an ordinary woman being harassed by an officer. She was Captain Lila Andrews, and she had faced far greater challenges than this. In her silence, there was strength, a power that Blake could not see or understand. And as the exchange continued, it became clear that his words, his tone, his judgments, all of it, would come back to him in ways he never expected. In the bustling grocery store, Lila Andrews moved calmly through the aisles, minding her own business. She was there simply to pick up a few things and go home, enjoying a quiet afternoon away from the pressures of her job as a police captain. She was off duty, dressed in casual clothes, with no sign of her rank or authority. To everyone around her, she looked like any other shopper, just a woman out to get groceries. But on the other side of the store, Officer Blake, a brash and arrogant cop, was also on duty that day. Blake had earned a reputation in the department, though not always a good one. He was known for his impulsive behavior, his quick judgments, and his tendency to look for trouble where there was none. Many of his colleagues knew him to be someone who often made snap decisions about people based on his own assumptions, never really taking the time to look deeper or see the full picture. Blake was the kind of officer who acted first and thought later. He thrived on the thrill of catching someone in the wrong, the satisfaction of calling out supposed bad behavior, whether or not it was actually happening. Today, as he scanned the crowd in the grocery store, his eyes landed on Lila. To him, she didn't seem like she belonged. Perhaps it was her calm demeanor, her quiet presence, or maybe something else he couldn't put his finger on, but he decided in an instant that she was suspicious. Without knowing anything about her, he made up his mind that she was someone he needed to watch closely. Lila, oblivious to Blake's gaze, continued with her shopping, picking up items from her list, focused on her task. But Blake's eyes stayed fixed on her every move. As she reached for a can on a high shelf, his suspicions only grew. In his mind, he had already labeled her, already decided that she was up to no good. His steps grew faster as he made his way across the store, following her, watching her with a hawk's intensity. Blake's suspicion turned into eagerness, his focus sharper. He was looking for any small mistake she might make, anything that would confirm his judgment of her. In his mind, he saw her as guilty, and he was just waiting for a reason to confront her. As she turned the corner into another aisle, Blake quickened his pace, ready to pounce. When he finally approached her, his presence was intense. His face held a stern expression, his eyes narrowing as he looked her up and down, already filled with judgment. Lila, sensing someone behind her, turned slowly and met his gaze. She saw the look in his eyes, the judgment, the assumption, and she knew instantly what was happening. But she kept her expression calm, her posture relaxed, refusing to let him see any hint of discomfort. "Ma'am," Blake said, his tone laced with arrogance, as if he already knew her guilt. "I need to ask you a few questions." His voice was loud, drawing the attention of other shoppers nearby. People began to turn their heads, curious about the commotion. Lila felt the weight of their stares, the way their eyes scanned her, and she knew they were wondering what she had done to attract this officer's attention. She looked at Blake calmly, her face showing no hint of fear or guilt. "Yes, officer," she replied, her tone polite and even. Blake crossed his arms, his posture aggressive, as if he were already preparing for a confrontation. "We've had some reports about suspicious activity here," he said, his voice still loud, making sure everyone could hear. "And you seem to fit the description of someone who might be up to something." Lila raised an eyebrow, surprised by his vague accusation. "Suspicious activity?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "I'm just here to shop. I haven't done anything wrong." But Blake was undeterred. In his mind, he had already decided she was guilty, and her calmness only fueled his belief that she was hiding something. "I need to see some identification," he demanded, extending his hand as if expecting her to comply immediately. Around them, a few customers stopped to watch the scene unfold. Some whispered to each other, casting glances at Lila, while others looked at Blake with a mixture of interest and curiosity. Lila could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgments forming in their minds. She knew that, to many of them, it would look like she had done something wrong, that Blake's uniform and loud accusations would make them believe she was guilty before she'd even had a chance to explain herself. Blake's voice grew louder, more forceful. "Show me some ID," he repeated, his tone harsh. "I need to know who you are and what you're doing here." Lila took a deep breath, her calm never wavering. She reached into her bag and pulled out her ID, handing it to him with a steady hand. She could see the intensity in his eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were beneath him, as if her very presence in the store was an offense. Blake took the ID, glancing at it briefly. But instead of recognizing her name or her rank, he ignored it, focusing only on his assumptions. He barely looked at the ID, handing it back with a dismissive gesture. In his mind, he didn't need to know who she was. He had already decided what he thought of her. "Tell me what you're doing here," he demanded, his voice still loud, still drawing the attention of the growing crowd. "I want to know exactly why you're here." Lila looked him straight in the eye, her gaze steady and unafraid. "I'm here to buy groceries," she replied simply, "just like everyone else in this store." But Blake wasn't satisfied with her answer. In his mind, there had to be more to her story, something that would prove his suspicions right. He asked her question after question, each one more invasive than the last, his tone growing more accusatory with every word. His questions were loud, and with each one, the people around them grew more curious, some of them watching with judgmental looks, others shaking their heads in disapproval. Lila felt the weight of their stares, the way their eyes followed her every move. She knew that Blake's loud accusations were creating an image in their minds, painting her as someone she was not. But she stood tall, holding her head high, refusing to let his words affect her. She knew who she was, and she knew she had done nothing wrong. Blake's voice grew even louder as he continued to question her, each accusation sharper, more abrasive. "I don't believe you," he said finally, his tone filled with disdain. "People like you always have something to hide." Lila felt a pang of frustration at his words, the way he dismissed her, reduced her to a stereotype in his mind. But she kept her expression calm, refusing to give him the reaction he was looking for. She knew that this was only the beginning, that his accusations would soon come back to him in ways he couldn't imagine. The crowd around them continued to watch, some people nodding in agreement with Blake's words, others murmuring to each other as they formed their own opinions. Lila felt the weight of their judgments, the way they looked at her with suspicion and doubt, but she held her ground, knowing that she didn't need to prove herself to them. Blake's questions became more aggressive, his tone harsher with every word. He accused her of stealing, of hiding something, of being someone she was not. Each accusation was louder than the last, drawing more attention, creating a scene that painted her as guilty in the eyes of those around them. But Lila refused to let his words affect her. She knew who she was, and she knew that his accusations were baseless, built on nothing more than his own assumptions and judgments. She stood tall, her gaze steady, her expression calm. In the crowded grocery store, the tense scene between Lila and Officer Blake continued to unfold. People lingered nearby, their eyes fixed on the two as they waited to see what would happen next. Lila stood calmly, her face composed, every movement deliberate and measured. She kept her eyes on Blake, listening carefully to every word he said, letting each accusation sink in, but never allowing him to see how it affected her. Blake, however, seemed unaware of her calm strength. He took her quietness as a sign of guilt, convinced that her reserved responses meant she was hiding something. The more she remained silent, the more he believed he was onto something, that he had cornered her into some kind of confession. His voice grew louder, his tone more intense with each question, as if he were hoping that the sheer force of his words would break her down. "Why don't you just tell me the truth?" Blake demanded, his tone filled with impatience and arrogance. "We both know there's more to this than you're letting on." Lila looked at him, her expression steady and calm. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she answered him with quiet politeness. "Officer, I'm only here to shop. I haven't done anything wrong." Her words were simple, and her voice was soft, but her gaze was steady, meeting his without fear. Blake frowned, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. He wasn't used to being met with such calm resistance. In his mind, this was supposed to be easy. He expected her to be nervous, to stumble over her words, to crack under his questioning. But instead, she remained poised, letting him say whatever he wanted, watching as he grew more and more frustrated. Blake's frustration turned into anger, and his questions became sharper, more invasive. He threw accusations at her, each one more absurd than the last, hoping to trip her up, to find some weakness in her responses. But Lila simply listened, her expression unchanged. She gave him polite, straightforward answers, never revealing more than necessary, keeping her responses as calm as possible. With each new accusation, Blake grew more desperate. His voice rose, his tone became more hostile, and he seemed almost desperate for her to react. But Lila only stood there, letting his words wash over her. She could see the impatience in his eyes, the irritation in his posture, and she knew that he was digging himself deeper with every word. She let him continue, knowing that his actions were only making the situation worse for him. Finally, after another round of baseless accusations, Lila spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "Officer, I think you may have the wrong idea about me," she said. Her words were measured, and there was a hint of something in her tone, something that Blake couldn't quite identify. It was almost a warning, a subtle reminder that he might not know as much as he thought. But Blake brushed her words aside, dismissing her quiet strength as if it were nothing. "Don't try to talk your way out of this," he snapped. "I know people like you. You think you can get away with things just by keeping quiet, but it's not going to work with me." Lila felt a flicker of frustration at his words, but she kept her face neutral, refusing to let him see any reaction. She had been through situations like this before, where people had made assumptions about her without knowing who she was or what she had accomplished. She knew that arguing with him would only make things worse, so she remained silent, letting him think he was in control, even as he grew more reckless in his words. Blake continued, his tone filled with condescension. "You think you're clever, don't you? Standing there, pretending like you're innocent. But I see right through you." Lila met his gaze, her eyes steady, her expression unchanging. "I'm not pretending anything, officer. I'm just here to shop," she replied softly. Her voice was calm, and her words were simple, but there was a strength behind them that he couldn't ignore. Blake's face twisted with frustration. He wasn't used to people standing up to him like this, especially not someone he had already decided was guilty. Her calmness unnerved him, made him feel as if he were the one being judged. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, throwing more accusations at her, hoping that one of them would stick. "You're hiding something," he said, his tone almost desperate. "Why don't you just admit it?" Lila looked at him, her expression almost sympathetic. She knew that his frustration was growing, that he was losing control of the situation, even if he didn't realize it. She could see the impatience in his eyes, the way his voice grew louder with each word, and she knew that he was digging himself into a hole that he wouldn't be able to escape. But she didn't say anything, didn't react to his words. She simply stood there, letting him continue, watching as he became more and more frustrated. Each insult, each accusation only strengthened her resolve, but she never flinched. She let him think that he was in control, knowing that his actions would soon catch up to him. Blake's tone grew more aggressive, his words sharper. "You know, people like you always think you're above the law. But I'm here to show you that you're not. No one is above the law." Lila held her head high, her gaze steady. She didn't respond to his words, didn't argue with him. Instead, she remained silent, letting his accusations hang in the air. She knew that he was playing into her hands, that his words were only making the situation worse for him. But she kept her composure, refusing to let him see any sign of weakness. Blake's frustration reached a boiling point, and his voice became louder, more forceful. "Why don't you just admit it?" he demanded. "We both know you're hiding something. Why don't you just confess?" But Lila only looked at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady. She knew that there was nothing to confess, that his accusations were baseless. She let him continue, knowing that his words would soon come back to him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Blake took a step back, his face twisted with anger. "Fine," he said, his tone filled with frustration. "Keep pretending, if that's what you want. But don't think for a second that I'm going to let this go." Lila watched him, her expression unchanging. She knew that his words were empty, that his threats held no power over her. She had faced people like him before, people who thought they could intimidate her, people who thought they could break her. But she had learned long ago that true strength came from within, from the quiet confidence that couldn't be shaken by the words of others. As Blake walked away, Lila felt a sense of relief, but also a sense of satisfaction. She knew that he had been wrong about her, that his assumptions had only revealed his own weaknesses. She had let him dig himself into a hole, knowing that his actions would soon catch up to him. And as she stood there, watching him walk away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of justice, a quiet, unshakable sense that he would soon face the consequences of his own actions. In the grocery store, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Officer Blake's face was flushed, his stance rigid, and his grip on his handcuffs was firm as he prepared to make his final move. He had been relentless, pressing Lila with questions, casting accusations, and ignoring her every calm response. With each accusation, he had grown louder, his voice echoing throughout the aisles, drawing even more attention from the people around them. The store was buzzing with whispers and murmurs as shoppers watched the scene unfold, curious, and even slightly shocked. Blake had convinced himself that he had cornered her, that he had caught someone in the act. To him, Lila was a woman who had dared to stand her ground, and he saw her quiet strength as a threat to his authority. He took her silence as defiance, her calmness as arrogance. Now, with his handcuffs in hand, he felt powerful. He was certain he would prove her guilty, show her who was in charge, and make an example of her. It didn't matter to him that she had been polite, that she had answered his questions without argument. He had labeled her in his mind, and now he was ready to act on that label. The crowd around them grew still, some people watching with shock, others with a mix of curiosity and unease. They saw Blake's determination, his forceful stance, and the way he held the cuffs with an almost aggressive pride. But Lila remained composed. She stood tall, her face calm, her expression unchanged. Inside, she was tired of his accusations, tired of the disrespect he had shown her, and tired of his arrogance. She knew the truth, and she knew the time had come for him to learn it too. As Blake reached out to grab her wrist, Lila raised her hand, stopping him with a single firm gesture. The crowd around them seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something was about to happen. For a moment, Blake looked at her hand, confused by her sudden assertiveness. He frowned, not understanding why she wasn't backing down, why she wasn't showing fear. To him, she was just an ordinary woman, someone who should have felt intimidated by his authority. But Lila's calmness and quiet strength held firm, and in that moment, she was no longer willing to let him continue his charade. With a steady hand, Lila reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather wallet. She held it calmly, her movements slow and deliberate, allowing everyone around her to see what she was doing. Blake watched, a smug look on his face, as if he believed she was finally complying, finally showing him some respect. But as she opened the wallet, revealing the shiny police badge inside, Blake's expression changed in an instant. The shiny badge and her police ID card glinted under the store's fluorescent lights, casting a glow that seemed to silence the entire room. The crowd's whispers faded into silence as every eye fell on the badge in her hand. It was unmistakable, a badge of authority, a badge that only belonged to someone of high rank. And on that badge, clear as day, was her title: Police Captain. The color drained from Blake's face as he stared at the badge, the reality of the situation sinking in slowly. He blinked, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. His hand, which had been so confidently holding the cuffs, fell to his side, and his grip loosened. The arrogance, the pride, the aggressive stance, all of it vanished in an instant. He looked at her, his face pale, his expression filled with shock and disbelief. Lila's gaze was steady, her expression calm yet powerful. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft, but carried a weight that commanded the entire room's attention. "I think it's time you understand who I am, officer," she said, each word clear and precise. There was no anger in her voice, no raised tone, just a quiet authority that held more strength than any of Blake's shouting had. The crowd around them was utterly silent, every person hanging onto her words, watching as Blake's world unraveled before their eyes. The tension in the room was palpable, like electricity in the air, as everyone took in the sight of the police captain standing before them, her badge a symbol of the authority she carried. For the first time since the confrontation began, Blake looked small, his shoulders slumping, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and regret. Lila didn't look away from him. Her gaze was piercing, steady, holding him accountable without needing to raise her voice. "You made a grave mistake today," she continued, her voice unwavering. "You let your assumptions and your prejudice cloud your judgment. And as an officer, that's a dangerous path to walk." Blake swallowed, visibly shaken. His hands trembled slightly, and he took a small step back, the cuffs he had held so confidently now slipping from his fingers. He opened his mouth to speak, but he couldn't find the words, couldn't form a coherent sentence. All the power he had felt just moments before was gone, replaced by a sense of helplessness that he had never experienced before. Lila took a step forward, closing the distance between them, her gaze never leaving his. "Do you realize the harm you've caused today?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying a tone of disappointment. "You humiliated someone without cause, without reason, all because you thought you knew who I was without taking a moment to truly see." Blake's eyes dropped to the floor, his face flushed with shame. He couldn't meet her gaze, couldn't bring himself to look at the badge that had shattered his perception of her. The silence in the store was heavy, the weight of his mistake hanging in the air for everyone to witness. Lila didn't stop there. She knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was a lesson, a reminder of the responsibility that came with the badge he wore. As officers, we are called to protect, to serve, and to act with integrity, she said, her tone firm but calm. We are not here to judge, to assume, or to mistreat others. That badge you wear demands respect, not just from others, but from you. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, every person hanging on to her words, watching as Blake's arrogance crumbled. His face was red, his eyes still fixed on the ground, unable to meet the steady gaze of the woman he had wronged. He looked like a man who had been stripped of every ounce of pride, standing there exposed, his mistake laid bare for all to see. Lila held her badge in her hand, her fingers lightly touching the polished metal, a symbol of the authority she had earned through years of hard work and dedication. She took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle, allowing Blake to feel the full impact of his actions. She didn't rush, didn't let him off the hook with a quick reprimand. Instead, she let the silence linger, the gravity of the situation sinking into every corner of the room. "Respect," she said finally, breaking the silence, her voice soft but resolute. "That is what we owe to the people we serve. And respect begins with seeing people for who they are, not who we assume them to be." Blake's shoulders slumped, his face a picture of regret. The crowd around them remained silent, every person watching, their expressions a mix of awe and understanding. They had come to see a confrontation, but what they witnessed was a lesson, a moment of humility that would stay with each of them long after they left the store. Lila watched Blake for a moment longer, her gaze softening slightly. She could see the shame in his eyes, the realization of his mistake finally settling in. She didn't need to say anything more. The lesson had been learned, and the silence that followed was louder than any words she could have spoken. As she turned to leave, the crowd parted, people stepping aside to let her pass, their eyes filled with respect and admiration. Blake remained where he was, his head bowed, his pride shattered, left alone in the midst of the quiet crowd. And as Lila walked away, her calm, steady steps echoing through the silent aisles, she knew that her actions had left a mark, a reminder that respect, integrity, and humility were the true marks of a person's character. For Blake, the lesson was clear, and it was one he would carry with him from that day forward, a reminder that assumptions and arrogance could only lead to regret, and that true strength lay in seeing others with fairness, with compassion, and with the respect they deserved. After the tense encounter in the grocery store, word of what had happened spread quickly. Lila's calm and dignified response to Officer Blake's mistreatment made a powerful impression on everyone who had witnessed the scene. By the time she left the store, her story had already begun to ripple through the police department and the surrounding community. People were talking about how she had stood her ground without losing her composure, how she had revealed her true identity only when Blake had pushed things too far, and how she had shown everyone what it meant to act with true authority and integrity. Back at the police department, the news reached the higher-ups swiftly. Officers, supervisors, and even the department's chief heard about the incident. They learned about Blake's behavior, his unfounded accusations, and his poor treatment of a fellow officer, someone who, as it turned out, held a much higher rank than him. The chief was deeply disappointed and concerned. This was not the first time Blake had behaved in a way that brought shame to the department. In fact, as people began to talk, more stories of Blake's past behavior surfaced, tales of other instances where he had judged too quickly, acted too harshly, or made similar mistakes. The police department had a strict policy when it came to officer conduct. They were supposed to uphold a standard of fairness, respect, and integrity in their treatment of everyone, whether they were fellow officers or civilians. The department had worked hard to build a reputation of trust in the community, and they couldn't allow someone like Blake to tarnish that reputation. So, as the details of his encounter with Captain Lila Andrews continued to spread, the department knew they had to take action. An internal investigation was quickly launched. A team of senior officers and department officials reviewed footage from the store's security cameras, interviewed witnesses, and gathered statements from those who had been present. They watched how Blake had approached Lila, how he had ignored her calm responses, how he had escalated the situation without reason, and how he had completely dismissed her dignity and rights. They saw his aggression, his arrogance, and his refusal to listen, all traits that had no place in someone who was supposed to protect and serve the public. As the investigation continued, Blake's record was examined more closely. It didn't take long for other complaints against him to surface. Officers who had worked with him came forward with stories of their own, tales of Blake's impatience, his rush to judge, and his frequent disregard for protocol. Civilians also shared accounts of past encounters where they had felt mistreated or misjudged by him. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that painted a clear picture. Blake's actions at the grocery store were not an isolated incident. He had a history of letting his personal biases and quick judgments influence his actions, and it had finally caught up to him. Blake was suspended from duty, pending a full review of his conduct. The news of his suspension spread quickly throughout the department and the community. For some, it was a moment of relief, a sign that justice was being served. For others, it was a reminder of the importance of accountability, especially for those in positions of power. And for those who had been present at the grocery store, watching the encounter between Lila and Blake, it was a chance to reflect on their own actions, or lack thereof. Many of the onlookers who had witnessed Blake's treatment of Lila felt a sense of regret. They had seen an injustice happening before their eyes, yet they had stood by, watching silently. They hadn't spoken up, hadn't intervened, and now they felt the weight of that decision. As they learned more about Lila, as they discovered her role as a respected police captain and heard about her years of service, they realized the depth of the mistake they had made by remaining silent. They now saw her in a new light, not just as an officer, but as a person who stood for justice, fairness, and resilience. In the days following the incident, many people reached out to Lila to express their admiration and support. Fellow officers stopped by her office to commend her for the way she had handled herself in the grocery store, to tell her that they respected her calmness, her dignity, and her strength. They admired how she had faced down Blake's unfair treatment without losing her composure, and how she had held him accountable in a way that few others could have done. Her fellow officers saw her as a leader, a figure who exemplified everything they wanted the police force to stand for. The community also rallied around Lila. Local leaders, community members, and even people who had never met her sent messages of appreciation. They praised her for her courage, for her ability to handle a difficult situation with grace, and for her unwavering commitment to justice. People shared stories of their own encounters with her, stories of how she had helped them, protected them, or simply shown them kindness in moments of need. The incident at the grocery store had revealed a side of her that many people hadn't seen before, and it had made them realize how lucky they were to have someone like her serving their community. Lila received letters, phone calls, and messages from people who wanted her to know that they respected her, that they appreciated her, and that they stood with her. Some shared their own experiences of being judged unfairly or treated poorly, expressing their gratitude for the way she had handled herself and set an example. They felt inspired by her, and they wanted her to know that her actions had made a difference. In the weeks that followed, Lila's story continued to spread. News outlets picked up on the incident, sharing her story with a wider audience. Articles were written about her, interviews were requested, and her name became well known in the community and beyond. People admired her not only for her role as a police captain, but also for the way she had stood up to injustice, even when it came from within her own department. She became a symbol of integrity, someone who showed that true strength lay in respect, fairness, and resilience. Blake, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his actions. The suspension forced him to confront the impact of his behavior, to reflect on the choices he had made, and to understand the damage he had caused. He realized that his actions hadn't just affected Lila. They had also hurt the department's reputation, betrayed the trust of the community, and created unnecessary tension and division. For the first time, he had to face the reality of his own arrogance, his tendency to judge too quickly, and his failure to live up to the values of his badge. As he awaited the outcome of the review, Blake was left with a sense of regret, a deep awareness of how far he had strayed from the path he was supposed to follow. He realized that he had allowed his ego to guide his actions, that he had let his own biases cloud his judgment, and that he had failed to treat others with the respect they deserved. His suspension was a painful reminder that his actions had consequences, and that he had a responsibility to uphold the values of his position, a responsibility he had ignored for far too long. The department, meanwhile, took steps to ensure that incidents like this would not happen again. Training sessions were implemented, focusing on respect, empathy, and integrity. Officers were reminded of their duty to treat everyone with fairness, to approach every situation with an open mind, and to remember that their badges represented a commitment to justice. Lila's story was shared as an example, a reminder of the importance of professionalism, patience, and the power of handling difficult situations with dignity. Lila's impact reached far beyond that single grocery store encounter. Her actions had sparked a change, a renewed commitment to fairness and respect within the department. And for the community, she became more than just a police captain. She became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that justice is not just about power, but about compassion, integrity, and the strength to stand up for what is right, even in the face of mistreatment. As Blake's suspension was announced publicly, many of the people who had witnessed the incident at the store felt a renewed sense of respect for Lila. They realized that she had stood firm, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. Her actions served as a reminder to all of them that justice was not something to be taken lightly, that it required courage, patience, and the ability to see beyond assumptions. And as they watched her continue her work with the same quiet strength and dedication, they knew they had witnessed something truly meaningful, a lesson in what it meant to stand for justice, not just in words but in actions. In the end, Lila's dignity and grace turned a painful experience into a powerful lesson for everyone involved. She had shown them that true justice was rooted in respect, that power was nothing without integrity, and that the strongest leaders were those who lifted others up, rather than tearing them down. She had become a pillar of justice in her community, a symbol of what it meant to serve with honor, and her story continued to inspire those who had the privilege of knowing her. When Lila returned to her precinct after the incident, she walked through the familiar hallways with her head held high. She greeted her colleagues, offering her usual calm smile, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But everyone knew what she had been through. The story of what had happened at the grocery store had spread through the precinct, and people were talking about her with a new level of respect. The way she had handled herself, with calm strength and steady dignity, had left an impression on everyone who heard about it. As she moved through the precinct, officers who had known her for years looked at her with a fresh sense of admiration. Some gave her a nod, others a pat on the back, showing their support in quiet ways. Lila could sense the shift in the atmosphere around her, the newfound respect in her colleagues' eyes. She had always been a respected leader, but now she was more than that. She was an example, a reminder of the power that lay in quiet strength and unwavering integrity. Lila's experience at the grocery store reminded everyone of the importance of seeing beyond appearances. Many in the precinct understood that it was easy to make snap judgments about others based on surface-level impressions. They had seen it happen before, had even been guilty of it themselves at times. But now, Lila's story stood as a powerful lesson. It was a reminder that no one should be underestimated, that sometimes the quietest people carry the most inner strength, and that true power doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be steady and sure. The department began to adopt new ways of thinking, influenced by Lila's example. Meetings with officers now included talks about humility, empathy, and respect. These were qualities that Lila had embodied, and everyone was starting to see how important they were. Officers were reminded to look past what they thought they knew about people, to listen before jumping to conclusions, and to remember that every person deserved to be treated with dignity. The chief of the precinct even used Lila's story in his briefings, speaking about her courage and the calm authority she had shown in the face of mistreatment. He reminded the team that a uniform or a badge didn't give anyone the right to judge others unfairly or to assume things about people without understanding them. Instead, he urged them to follow Lila's example, to be patient, to be fair, and to treat everyone they met with the respect they would want for themselves. Respect isn't just given, it's earned, he said, echoing Lila's actions. And those who judge by appearances may never understand the power they overlook. His words resonated throughout the precinct, reminding every officer of the values that they had sworn to uphold. Officers who worked directly under Lila saw her as more than just their captain. They saw her as a mentor, someone who led by example, who showed them what it meant to serve with honor. Her ability to stand strong without anger, to demand respect without force, left a lasting mark on each of them. Younger officers looked up to her, realizing that true leadership didn't require shouting orders or displaying aggression. They saw that real strength came from treating people with kindness, even when kindness wasn't shown in return, and that true respect was built through actions, not words. The community also felt the impact of Lila's actions. People who had heard about what happened in the grocery store spoke of her with admiration, sharing the story with their families, friends, and neighbors. Lila had become a symbol of quiet courage, someone who had shown that strength didn't always come from loud displays or outward power. Instead, her strength lay in her inner confidence, her knowledge of who she was, and her unwavering commitment to her values. Mothers and fathers in the community told their children about Captain Lila Andrews, explaining that she was someone to look up to, someone who had faced prejudice without allowing it to shake her sense of self-worth. Parents spoke of her as an example of what it meant to be dignified, to stand firm in who you are, and to demand respect not by force, but by living with integrity. Lila's story spread even further when local newspapers and radio stations picked it up. People across the city read about the captain who had faced down an unfair accusation and handled it with the utmost grace. They admired her restraint, her patience, and her strength in a situation that could have easily turned negative. People were inspired by her story, finding strength in her example, and some even wrote letters to the precinct, expressing their respect and appreciation for her actions. The letters were filled with gratitude and admiration. Many of them spoke about how Lila's story had reminded them of the importance of treating people fairly, of seeing the good in others, and of not jumping to conclusions. Others shared their own experiences of feeling judged or misunderstood, thanking Lila for standing up against prejudice in such a powerful, quiet way. The precinct received letter after letter, each one a testament to the impact Lila's actions had on the community. As time passed, Lila continued her work, leading her team with the same dedication and respect she had always shown. But now, there was a new layer of admiration in the way her colleagues and community saw her. She had become more than just an officer. She was a pillar of justice, someone who had shown what it meant to truly embody the values of the force. One day, during a team meeting, an officer who had been there during her confrontation with Blake stood up and spoke. He thanked Lila for the way she had handled the situation, admitting that watching her had changed his perspective. He shared that he had learned to see people differently, to take a moment before making assumptions, and to approach every situation with respect and understanding. He thanked her for being an example of what it truly meant to serve with honor. Lila listened quietly, nodding in acknowledgement. She knew that her actions had resonated with others, that her choice to remain calm and dignified in the face of unfair treatment had inspired those around her. She hoped that her story would continue to remind others that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned by treating others with dignity. Looking around the room, she saw the faces of her team, the people she worked with every day. She saw the newfound respect in their eyes, the way they looked at her not just as a leader, but as someone they could look up to. Lila felt a sense of pride, not in herself, but in the fact that her actions had made a difference. She had shown her team, her community, and even herself that true strength was quiet, steady, and rooted in respect. The words of her chief echoed in her mind. Those who judge by appearances may never understand the power they overlook. She knew those words would stay with her for a long time, a reminder of the lesson she had lived out in the grocery store that day. Her journey had shown everyone around her that appearances were deceiving, that true power was found in the heart, and that the quietest voices often carried the greatest strength. And so, Lila continued to serve, her story becoming a part of the precinct's history, a reminder to every officer who walked through its doors. She had become a symbol of integrity, a living example that the power of respect could change hearts and inspire strength.